In 1870, during the Franco-Prussian War, a young Nietzsche served briefly as a medical orderly and watched something that stayed with him for the rest of his life. He watched soldiers who had trained for years in physical combat lose completely to something they'd never been taught to fight at all. Fear, hesitation, the psychological collapse that happens in a man's mind long before his body ever fails him. He came away convinced that the actual battlefield in war and in life was never really physical. It was psychological, and almost nobody was being trained for it. Decades later, this conviction became one of the sharpest and least understood threads running through his entire philosophy. A set of ideas about psychological strength, strategy, and self-mastery that reads less like academic philosophy and more like a field manual for anyone who has ever felt outmaneuvered by people around them. If this is your first time here, before we go further, hit subscribe, tap that bell icon, and drop a like, because this channel is building a full series unpacking Nietzsche's ideas. And this one is about to change how you look at every conflict in your life. Here's the real question this video is built around. What did Nietzsche actually believe separates people who get quietly outmaneuvered their entire lives from people who never seem to lose their footing, no matter who they're up against? Let's be clear about something before we go further, because it matters. Nietzsche's version of mental warfare has nothing to do with lying, manipulating, or deceiving other people. He had genuine contempt for that kind of behavior and considered it a sign of weakness dressed up as cleverness. What he was actually describing was something closer to psychological sovereignty, becoming someone whose mind simply cannot be captured, provoked, or controlled by anyone else, no matter how hard they try. That's the real battlefield he was pointing to, and it starts with the concept most people have never even considered a skill. The first principle is what Nietzsche called raisonnement, a French word he used deliberately because he believed it describes something the ordinary word resentment didn't fully capture. Raisonnement is the slow, corrosive bitterness that builds in someone who feels powerless against another person, and instead of confronting that powerlessness honestly, buries it, disguises it as moral superiority, and lets it quietly poison their thinking for years. Nietzsche believed this is the single most common way people lose the psychological war without even realizing they're in one. Someone wrongs you, and instead of processing it directly, you carry it. You replay it. You build an entire private narrative around how unfair it was, how much better you are than the person who did it, how deeply you deserve vindication. And the whole time, the person who actually wronged you is living their life, completely unaware they still occupy this much space in your head, rent-free, for years. This is the first and most important battle Nietzsche identified, and it happens entirely inside your own mind, before any external conflict even begins. Someone who has learned to process a wrong quickly, honestly, and completely, without letting it calcify into permanent bitterness, has already won a fight that most people don't even know they're losing. The second principle is about reading motive rather than behavior. Nietzsche was obsessed, throughout his writing, with the idea that most people's stated reasons for what they do are almost never their actual reasons. He believed that beneath nearly every claim of moral high ground, every accusation, every expression of concern, there's usually a deeper, less flattering motive, the desire for power, status, or control, dressed up in language that sounds noble. This isn't cynicism for its own sake. Nietzsche believed learning to see this clearly is a form of self-defense. Someone who takes every stated motive at face value, is vulnerable to being maneuvered by people who understand exactly how to disguise their real intentions. Someone who has trained themselves to look past the stated reason to the actual interest underneath it is far harder to manipulate because they're no longer responding to the story being told. They're responding to what's actually happening. The third principle is patience, and Nietzsche treated it as something close to a weapon. He believed most conflicts are lost not because one side lacks strength, but because they lack the ability to wait. The person who needs to win the argument immediately, who needs the last word right now, who cannot tolerate the discomfort of an unresolved tension for even a single day, hands an enormous amount of power to whoever is patient enough to simply let time do the work instead. Nietzsche wrote about this in terms of what he called the long game of the strong, the willingness to absorb a loss today without reacting, without needing immediate vindication. Because you understand that reacting from urgency is almost always a worse position than responding once the full picture has become clear. This requires a kind of internal stillness most people have never practiced, because the instinct to defend yourself immediately the moment you feel threatened is one of the oldest and strongest instincts a human being has. The fourth principle is refusing to fight on terms someone else has set for you. Nietzsche believed one of the most effective psychological tactics anyone can use against you is provoking a reaction and then judging you by the terms of that reaction rather than by anything you actually intended. Someone insults you, you lash out, and now the conversation is about your temper instead of their insult. Someone questions your competence, you become defensive, and now the conversation is about your insecurity instead of the original question. Nietzsche believed the strong mind refuses this trade. It notices when it's being invited into a fight defined by someone else's terms, and simply declines to show up on those terms at all. This is closely tied to something Nietzsche wrote about self-mastery. The idea that the person who reacts instantly to every provocation has, in a real sense, handed control of their own behavior to whoever is doing the provoking. The truly strong mind, in his view, has enough distance from its own impulses to choose its response deliberately, rather than being yanked around by whatever the other person decided to say. The fifth principle, and perhaps the most important, is understanding that most people you're up against are not actually your real opponent. Nietzsche believed the vast majority of what feels like external conflict is actually a reflection of an internal one. The colleague who undermines you, the rival who seems to have an advantage, the person whose approval you're desperate to win. None of them are the real battlefield. The real battlefield is your own reactivity, your own need for validation, your own inability to remain steady regardless of what they do. Master that, and external conflict loses most of its power over you, regardless of how skilled or aggressive the other person actually is. Fail to master that, and you can defeat every external rival you'll ever face and still lose, because the war was never actually out there. Put these 5 principles together, and you get something far more sophisticated than a set of manipulation tactics. Process your resentments honestly instead of letting them calcify. Read the actual motive behind stated reasons, rather than accepting them uncritically. Treat patience as a genuine strategic advantage, not a weakness. Refuse to fight on terms someone else has set for you. And recognize that your own internal reactivity, not the person in front of you, is almost always the real opponent. Nietzsche believed this combination produces something rare and genuinely formidable, a mind that other people cannot easily provoke cannot easily manipulate, and cannot easily read, not because it's hiding anything dishonest, but because it has simply stopped being controlled by the impulses that make most people so predictable. So here's the question worth sitting with. Where in your own life have you been fighting the wrong battle entirely? Reacting to someone else's provocation, carrying resentment you never fully processed, needing the last word in an argument that would have resolved itself if you'd simply had the patience to let it? And what would actually change in every conflict you're currently navigating if the first battlefield you took seriously was the one inside your own mind before you ever worried about anyone else's? Nietzsche never promised this would make conflict disappear. He promised something more useful, that the person who has mastered themselves first is very difficult to defeat, no matter who they're up against. If this video gave you something worth thinking about, make sure you're subscribed with the bell turned on, because the next one goes even deeper into exactly how Nietzsche believed self-mastery becomes your greatest strategic advantage, and you won't want to miss it.